We recently spoke to Bungie community manager Deej about the Black Armory, and he confirmed that Scourge of the Past is much larger than the raid layers added to the original Leviathan raid. That being said, it's also smaller than Forsaken's Last Wish raid, which is no surprise, given its shorter development time. Well, gosh darn it, I sure hope the raid is substantial in content. After all, Black Armory has no cinematic campaign, no PvP maps, no vendor refresh, one set of weapons divided between the forges and the raid, only 5 exotics, 1 for each forge, 1 tied to a quest, and 1 that is the raid exotic. There's no new catalyst, no new or returning exotic armor, there's no new strikes. Hell, they couldn't even be bothered to make all the pre-Forsaken Nightfall loot randomly rolled with curated rolls to give people something to chase. Trials is still on permanent hiatus with faction rallies, so with the raid being the only actual piece of content in this DLC, yeah, the raid probably ought to be good, and somewhat large. You had one job! What's going on, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages, Joker back again, once again, so follow me here for a second. Imagine if somebody said, you know what we should do? We should take the intro to Spire of Stars, we should reskin it, and slightly tweak the base mechanics, and then boil it down till it's basically nothing more than take ball, throw said ball at the big thing in the center of the map that you're obviously supposed to throw it at. Actually, that's not quite right, is it? Because this is just a reskinned version of this. And this is the bulk of what I'll call the more accessible content in Black Armory. Of course, by accessible, what I mean is, although it is somewhat inaccessible for 90% of the player base, if not more, right now, due in no large part to level restrictions, which I should note at the time of writing this review, Bungie has done a server-side tweak to drop the base encounter 5 levels. Whether this will carry on to the other forges, I don't really know, but levels and the ability for players to complete said content on day 1 or even week 1 isn't really relevant to this video as a whole. So any criticism I have will be geared more towards the actual content itself, its longevity, its rewards, and overall replayability of the content, and not an arbitrary measure of when I believe players should be able to finish said content. That's not to say that I won't comment on the execution of it, but it really has no bearing on my review of it. With all of that said, this is the meat of the content for most players. Oops, wrong one. I mean, this is the bulk of the content for most players. With the Forge being basically a reskin of this Hive Crystal mechanic, could you blame me for getting it mixed up? And this same reskinned gameplay loop will be what all Forges have. This is what most players outside of the 30% that will ever do the raid will engage with the exception of the exotic quest line for the last word, the Draw, which is an exotic quest, so it's a one and done or one and done on multiple characters if that's your sort of thing, but what it isn't is a core gameplay loop that you interact with on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis for the foreseeable lifespan of the DLC. So regardless of how far off the Draw is or how good or how bad it is, it really doesn't matter because it's one of those things, it's one and done. You do it, maybe you choose to do it on your other characters if you really enjoyed it, but that's it. You have your weapon and go play Crucible, I guess. When the Season Pass was first announced, I said that each DLC would be the equivalent of an April update that we pay for. I see now that, perhaps, that was a rather unfair comparison for me to make, as the April updates have done more for the game than the Black Armory has, at least on initial release, and it did it for free. Now, anyone paying attention would have known that this DLC was going to be sparse on content. I think a lot of people are upset because when people like myself were saying, temper your expectations, only expect something along the lines of the April update, they didn't listen because they didn't like that comparison. Now, because every video is somebody's first, for those of you who don't know what the April update was an update added to the game in which older content was refreshed, recontextualized, and added to the game, along with a vendor refresh and the return of old exotics. This would often be released hand in hand with a huge sandbox update. So I think people hearing the April update comparison couldn't look past the one-to-one new DLC versus old refreshed content, instead of looking at the size comparison that was actually being made. And now they're upset. Large content updates don't always mean better content, though it does make it easier to look past the flaws, and smaller pieces of content don't always mean bad content. However, it does require the developer to focus and really hone in on the few pieces of content that they intend to deliver. And I really don't think, unless you're one of my detractors and you're just being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian and not wanting to add anything to this discussion, you're not going to disagree with that. But the execution of really good concepts has always been an issue for Bungie, and Black Armory is no exception. If you played either of the Forges, or if you've looked at the roadmap, you might get the sense that the way that the content for Black Armory is being rationed out is, to abuse an analogy,
sort of stretched like butter scraped over too much bread.
It's like they had just enough content for the 3 months to maybe get half the toast kind of lathered up, and they're like, let's just kind of scrape a little bit to the top. Maybe, just maybe, if we just stretch it out, maybe, just maybe, people won't notice how spread thin it really is, or how much content there actually is here, because there's not a lot of it. Now, some of you might be sitting there thinking,
but Joker, you're just bitching to bitch. You don't know the scope and scale of the content.
Really? Really? Without playing, the Joker has been right about everything in regards to the development of Destiny, regardless of whether you like how I deliver the message or not. I'm just gonna look at the roadmap. 3, maybe 4 forges, so 3 activities, maybe 4 activities that take maybe 10 minutes to complete each activity, and will take less to do so when people are properly leveled for said activity. 1 exotic quest in the draw, and I mean, how long did the Thunderlord quest actually take to complete? And I mean, how long did it actually take you to complete it, not how long was it stretched out for? It probably took most of you 10 to 15 minutes, once it was all there, to actually complete it. Hell, how long do most exotic quests actually take to complete? Provided the content isn't something like, go out and collect 200 bear asses. Then you come back and they're like, ah yes, I like these bear asses so much that I want you to go out and collect 200 more bear asses. But not just any bear asses. I want bear asses with stripes in them. Yes, there will be RNG involved. And no, it won't be on your side. That's not to say that we haven't had compelling quests like Outbreak Prime or Whisper of the Worm, but those are the minority, and they're compelling because they are the minority. Don't get me wrong, I want the draw to be really cool because last word, but if we sit back and we're realistic and we look at the exotic quests throughout the history of Destiny, poorly executed exotic quests outnumber really cool exotic quests 3-to-1. It's not even a contest. And then we get to the raid lair. And yes, regardless of what any Bungie spokesperson may say, it is just a raid lair. Now, before I go any further, I want to go ahead and state my impressions of the nuts and bolts and encounters of the raid. I think it's awesome. No, really, I think the raid is awesome. But, and you knew there was going to be a but, it has issues. Part of those issues are because the way Bungie is talking about the content, part of it is the way that the rewards were created for the content, and part of it is how we as players consume the content. So although the raid is hard but doable, and will only get easier with time and levels and explanations and guides and understanding, and it introduces things to the Destiny universe that at first blush seem kinda silly, because really, if the Fallen had the technology to create giant mechs, like Titans, like Metal Gears, really? Why haven't they used them before now? But details. The important part is the fight is fun, not necessarily that it makes all that much sense. Sometimes gameplay is just vastly more important than lore. Sometimes gameplay is just vastly more important than lore. That said, I opened this video talking about how Bungie stated that the raid was larger than the raid layers of old. At the time of writing this review, the raid was completed in 2 hours. Actually, I believe it was 1 hour and 42 minutes after it was released. For comparison, it took Destiny's best players 7 hours to finish the Spire of Stars raid lair. And if I'm not mistaken, the world's first for Eater of Worlds was completed in just 2 hours by an LFG pickup group. The 2-hour world's first completion time for the raid should tell you basically everything you need to know about the size and difficulty of the raid. So if there's no denying that it's a fun experience, then what's my problem with it? It comes back to the loot. Doing something in a game like a raid once or twice or 3 or 4 times is fun, there's no denying that. However, at a point it does become a chore, so incentives are necessary to keep people playing it. If there's something that I really want to get from a raid, like the Vault of Glass had the Vex Mythoclast, then I'm going to keep grinding until I get that weapon or that piece of armor or that role I want. However, when you don't have the plethora of loot or even desirable loot to chase after, well, then you play content once or twice just to experience it, but outside of helping friends, you really have no compelling reason to come back to it. And to be fair, this is a problem with how we, the player base, consume the content. But, also to be fair, this is how Bungie has trained us to consume their content, to treat it like it's cheap and disposable. So what loot can you get from the raid? With Black Armory, there was 2 full armor sets outside of the cash shop introduced into the game. 1 set for the forges and 1 set for the raid. And while not identical, they do share a lot of the same in-game design linguistics. I'm not a huge fan of the designs, but I'm sure somebody is, and the armor's not really the problem. No, ladies and gents, boys and girls, guardians of all ages, where the armor is not our problem, the weapons are. For you see, the raid only has 5 weapons, 4 of which are part of the Forge set: the rocket launcher, the fusion rifle, the shotgun, and the scout rifle, with the 5th being the exotic falling grenade launcher. I'm sort of messed up that it's not Dreg's Promise, I'm gonna be honest. So let me make sure I understand what's going on here. Bungie only had 3 pieces of content that they had to develop for: the Forges, the raid, and the exotic quest. And for the sake of argument, we'll say that there's a dungeon, and maybe that dungeon has a 4th forge, or, you know what, best case scenario, there's a dungeon and a 4th forge. So there was no vendor refresh, meaning they didn't develop new Crucible gear, new Gambit gear, new Vanguard gear, or new faction gear or Trials gear. The only gear introduced outside of the raid and the forges was refurbished gear, which is just a reskin of Year 1 weapons, a set of Iron Banner armor for each class, and some of the Iron Banner weapons from Year 1 were moved into Year 2. On top of that, like I said, there's no new Trials gear, there's no new faction gear, there doesn't seem to be any new catalyst, there's no new or returning exotic armor pieces, no new strikes, no reworked Nightfall loot, and this is what we got for the raid. We got 1 set of armor, and then the raid has the remaining 4 weapons not available at the other forges. Like, you couldn't have given the raid its own loot, like its own weapon pool, not just the remainder of another weapon pool. Like, really? You guys did this with the Leviathan weapons, and nobody liked it then, when you took 1 set of weapons and curated it across 3 different raids. Nobody liked that. Why did you do it again here? It's a raid. It's a pinnacle activity. It should have its own loot.
Hey, just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
Now, I know it's easy to sit here in my ivory tower and list off all the things not in this DLC. This was never meant to be a full-scale DLC. So the purpose of my doing so is to illustrate the things that Bungie wasn't working on and compare it to what they delivered, what they developed. And when doing so, I find a lot of Black Armory to be lacking. How do you fail to deliver this badly, when the scope of what you had to get right was so small when compared to other projects? Is it really too much to ask that a pinnacle activity like the raid has its own weapon loot pool, and not just the leftovers from another one? Black Armory and the Season Pass in general is an interesting experiment. This is the sort of content cycle release that I think most people expected when the live team was originally created. Provide this sort of content between larger content releases. Destiny is, after all, a games as a service, ever-evolving living world game, and it's hard to keep players engaged between big releases when you don't have anything for them to do. And I think the kind of content illustrated on this roadmap, if centered between large releases, on paper, will keep at least a portion of the player base engaged. I don't have an issue with smaller content. Hell, I don't have an issue with paying $10 for 3 months of smaller content. What I do take issue with is the quality of that content. The raid has some interesting moments and ideas, but like every raid in Destiny, the loot is what matters past the first couple of playthroughs. It's what brings people back. The Forges, the main piece of content that most players are going to engage with, is just this. Reskinned as this, that you do after you start a quest for a weapon that has you spend most of your time on the Leviathan doing this. To the sum of a couple hundred yellow bar enemies. This doesn't have longevity. It's cute, and you go and play it now, but once you get the handful of weapons that you're looking for, or if you're a hardcore collector and you just gotta catch them all, once you do it, there's no reason to do it anymore. It's not that in-depth of an activity. You're literally just killing enemies and doing this. The Forges and the Raid are very disposable content, and they'll be irrelevant for most people well before the lifecycle of the DLC has passed. We've seen this with other Horde modes, like Prison of Elders or Escalation Protocol, which was way more involved than this, and ultimately disposable. I won't speak to the potential of the dungeons or the Last Word quest more than I already have, except to say that it really needs to be good, and I'll cover those when they're released. That said, I am rooting for the Last Word quest to be good. This is the second piece in Destiny 2 of a larger story that has played out in Destiny 1 and will be continuing to play out over the next 2 DLC releases. As a lot of you know, my favorite lore deals with Thorn, the Last Word, Shin Malphur, the Shadows of Yore. I really like that stuff, so yeah, if it could just not suck, that would be great. But back to Black Armory. With Black Armory, Bungie had a chance to start strong, with this new idea, this proof of concept. Instead, what we've gotten, in my opinion, is poorly executed, stretch-thin content that feels kind of cheap, like it was created to be disposable, which is truly a disappointment. After Forsaken and how it changed the way that we view endgame content, and the stellar job that it did doing that, this feels like a step back. In my opinion, they should have done things like have vendor refreshes. There should have been an introductory questline that had people complete one forge before requiring them to grind up to an endgame activity for DLC that they just bought. The raid loot should have been treated with more respect and shouldn't be just the leftover scraps of another activity. Nightfall loot should have been looked at and brought forward, especially if you're not going to create any new Nightfall loot or give us any new strikes, as to give that pre-Forsaken content more relevancy when it rolls around. To me, with this DLC, there's just a lot of easy fixes for things that were already in the game, and missed opportunities. This DLC seems like a rationed out, disposable bare necessity, like something Bungie had to create. It feels very corporate, very built for purpose, very, well, like I keep saying, disposable. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below, and like always, stay frosty.